Well, good evening and welcome to you all. My name's Paul Trabilko and it's my privilege to introduce Professor John Barclay tonight. It's also great to be able to welcome some people who are joining us via live stream, so welcome to you. And this event will also be recorded and the podcast will be available in a few weeks on our website if you'd like to have another look. As I say, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor John Barclay tonight. John did his PhD at Cambridge under Professor Morna Hooker, and he then taught at Glasgow University from 1984 to 2003, and he then became the Lightfoot Professor of Divinity at the University of Durham. John has published a whole range of seminal books and many articles and book chapters. His books include Obeying the Truth, a study of Paul's ethics in Galatians, Jews in the Mediterranean diaspora from Alexander to Trajan, Colossians and Philemon in the New Testament Guide series, a translation and commentary of Josephus's Against Apion in the Brill series, Pauline churches and diaspora Jews, Paul and the Gift, which came out in 2015 and won a number of book prizes, Paul, A Very Brief History. According to John, the website, he's supervised 46 doctoral students to successful completion, which is an amazing achievement, I think. John was also the editor of New Testament Studies, the premier journal in the discipline from 2009 to 2013. Tonight, John is giving a lecture on early Christianity and the survival of the poor. So please join me in welcoming John. Thanks.
Very much indeed, Paul, for your welcome, and it's an enormous pleasure for me to be here again. Thank you for all of you for coming out on this lovely afternoon. I want to record my thanks to the Department of Theology and Religion, where I've been a visiting scholar for the last few months. This is my third long sabbatical here in Dunedin, which is now, I think you could say, our second home. And it's been a real treat to be here, a great privilege to be here. Thank you to Will Sweetman, the head of department, for his invitation. I'd like to thank Cara Jane Smith, if you could send the thanks back to her. She is the administrator who's done a lot to make my life easy here. But thanks also to all the colleagues in the theology program, Murray, Tim, Chris, Katie, David, Lynn. Thank you to all of you, but especially to my good friend Paul. I've lost count of the number of times in which I've been greeted as Paul as I've walked around the university. Several people have wondered if we're twins. I was once asked if there is a kind of mold for New Testament scholars, which we come out looking the same. But it's been a privilege to be considered Paul because, of course, he has such a good reputation here that people are very friendly to me, even if because they think they know me. But thank you, Paul, for that and for you and your family and welcome you've given to myself and to my wife, Diana. I have given you a handout. I hope you have access to that, and that will give you the structure of what we're doing in this lecture, and it also enables you, if you nod off for a moment, to come back and find out where we are. Now, it's commonly believed that in the Greek and Roman worlds of antiquity, no one cared about the poor, who were generally feared, despised, and ignored. That's what's commonly believed. The exception, it is held, were Jews and Christians who did care about the poor, and not only about their own poor, but about others' poor as well. They did so, it's held, by instituting novel forms of charity or almsgiving which reached all the way down to the economic bottom. And Christians in particular were unique, it is held, in advocating wholly disinterested, non-reciprocal forms of giving in which gifts expected nothing in return. Such is the common story. I find it circulating at both a popular level and at a scholarly level, and as a moral incentive for Christian giving, it's powerful and attractive. After pondering the historical sources for some time, I've come to believe there are fragments of truth in that story, but it generally starts from the wrong place, goes by the wrong routes, and comes to the wrong conclusions. I want to start from a different place by asking not what the rich gave or didn't give to the poor, but how the poor survived by supporting one another. The early Christians were, I think, on the whole, poor themselves. So that most early Christian giving was at this, you might say, horizontal social level, not vertically from the rich to the poor. Exploring things from this angle via the webs of mutual support among the poor, we'll better see what, if anything, was distinctive about Christians. And in the course of this, we should be careful not to import assumptions from the practices and ideologies of modern Western philanthropy, which, of course, is typically figured as flowing down one way from the rich to the poor. So what can we say about the poor in antiquity? Well, what do we mean by the poor? The term, as you know, is problematic in lots of ways. It's vague, it's elastic, easily stretched this way and that. It's a relative term that should make us ask, poor in comparison to whom, or in relation to what? Among the poor, there are always small gradations, so that the poor can mean anyone poorer than us. In the ancient world, we find the term used extremely loosely, sometimes for aristocratic families who were down at heel, sometimes very differently for the absolutely destitute, and in fact for all points along the economic spectrum in between. The term has a certain emotional, moral, and rhetorical weight which can cloud our thinking. A recent attempt at being precise regarding economic levels in the ancient world has been advanced by the New Testament scholar Steve Friesen in combination with the classicist Walter Scheidel. And on the back of your handouts, you'll see Friesen's summary of his 7-point, what he calls, poverty scale. There's a lot about this that is imprecise and educated guesswork, as Friesen would be the first to admit, but I think the basic contours are right. At the top are a tiny percentage constituting the elite. The first 3 points total less than 3%, and these possess or control the vast majority of wealth in the Roman Empire. At the bottom, at subsistence level, what he calls PS6, and below subsistence level, PS7, Friesen puts nearly 70% of the population. And in between PS4 and 5, a middling section which has enough wealth to be cushioned against immediate economic shocks. Part of the point of the scale is to insist that there is a middling portion of the population, but my focus today is on that huge ocean of people at points 6 and 7. 70% of the 60 million people in the Roman Empire equates to about 42 million people at or below subsistence level. What do I mean by at subsistence level? That's the level of income and nutrition necessary to survive. A key feature here is the unpredictability and insecurity of life at this economic margin. Survival is precarious for those in short-term and unstable work, in families ever vulnerable to illness and death, and in an economy prone to shocks that send food prices suddenly shooting up. As R.H. Tawney once said of the Chinese poor, their position is, quote, that of a man standing permanently up to the neck in water, so that even a ripple is sufficient to drown him. That's a good definition of those at subsistence level. In this situation, survival depends on networks of support, a social fabric that can support you and lift you for a while when the water level rises. These are the networks that connect a household, first and foremost, to their kin, who have a strong moral obligation to assist where they can, and beyond kin to friends and neighbors with whom they've built relationships of trust. I shall say more about those networks in a moment, but suffice to say for now that their core characteristic is reciprocity. I am obliged to help you when you're in crisis, a sudden illness or loss of work, on the understanding that you will help me when I'm in crisis myself. Very many of the poor in the ancient world, of course, died prematurely of malnutrition or disease. But if the poor did survive, it was because of such webs of mutual support. Those at the very bottom in Frieson's PS7, we might call the destitute, in distinction from the poor. There's no clear terminological distinction in the ancient sources. The Greek words penes, and ptokos were often used interchangeably. But the distinctive feature of what I call the destitute is that their networks were broken or had gone under as well. Beggars pleaded for aid from passers-by precisely because they had no one else left to ask. The homeless slept outside under theatre arches because they had no family support. And stray children were left to fend for themselves because they'd been orphaned or abandoned by their impoverished parents. Deprived of any safety net, the destitute, like Lazarus in Jesus' parable, were not likely to survive for long. It's worth reflecting for a moment on the vulnerabilities of the poor and why their fortunes were so fluid. I'll focus here on the free poor rather than slaves, and on the urban poor, the context of early Christianity, rather than poor farmers who generally had more options for survival. Fundamental here are the fluctuations in unskilled or low-skilled labor. Most work was impermanent. Labor was oversupplied. Think of the day laborers in Jesus' parable of the vineyard workers. And the availability of work was dependent on wider economic forces. Without employment, there's no income. Without income, no food. Food prices could fluctuate because of the weather, the security of the grain supply, and the behavior of the rich who hoarded grain. And when food shortages turned to famine, whole networks among the poor collapsed at the same time. From analyses of bones and teeth, archaeologists are beginning to get some sense of ancient nutrition. And, of course, from malnutrition or diet of insufficient quality, all kinds of health dangers ensue. Premature or stillborn children, stunted growth, skin conditions resulting from vitamin deficiency, all these are well documented from antiquity, as, of course, from equally poor environments today. It's impossible to quantify, but one of the symptoms of poverty most noted in antiquity was the abandonment of unwanted infants. Families who could not afford another mouth to feed were prone to leave babies in a public place where they might die or someone might pick them up to rear them as a slave. It's just ubiquitous in the ancient world, frequently commented on. The poor were also disproportionately prone to crime, accident, and injury, and since they were rarely able to afford medicines, they suffered from untreated infections which either killed them or left them permanently disabled, for instance, deaf or blind. Many children lost their mothers in childbirth, and since fathers were generally 10 to 12 years older than mothers, many lost their fathers, the main breadwinner, quite early in their lives. Injury, illness, death, unemployment, all these constituted major emergencies for the poor. But the everyday challenges of life on the margin also meant that the poor constantly needed to borrow money or food from one another, repeatedly cycling goods and services around their networks of reciprocity. Yet glimpses of this from our ancient sources, and we can, I think, with caution, fill those out by contemporary ethnographic studies of the life of the poor today, from which I've learned much. This is constant, low-level reciprocity, and it's a fact ignored by the popular story outlined at the beginning. It's not the case that no one cared about the poor if you take account of the all-important fact that the poor cared for each other. By no one, we're thinking of state institutions or macro charities, which of course didn't exist in antiquity, and it would be anachronistic to expect them. These are the everyday forms of assistance, sharing, and swapping that go under the radar of the elite, who wrote most of our sources, and of course never got memorialized in inscriptions. Visiting and aiding a sick relative, looking after a friend's child, lending a small sum of money when a brother can't afford his rent, helping pay for a funeral, lending or making clothes. These are the small-scale but essential favors that circulate in networks of reciprocity. It's a basic rule of gifts or benefits in the ancient world that all gifts invite and expect a return at some future time and in some other form. As has often been noticed, and I'm sure you've heard this, and it's right, the poor are very generous. And this is partly, and I don't mean to in any way disparage it, but this is partly because in social terms they have to be, to create or sustain the relations from which they will receive help when the need arises. In Carol Stack's wonderful analysis of swapping in a black contemporary American neighborhood, a book called All Our Kin, she quotes an informant named Ruby Banks, and I'm sorry, I'm not even going to attempt the American accent here. Sometimes I don't have a damn dime in my pocket, nor a crying penny to get a box of diapers, milk, a loaf of bread. But you have to have help from everybody and anybody, so you don't turn no one down when they come round for help. You need to give because you know you will also need to get. By the same token, if you give or lend to someone and there's no return, that is the end of your friendship. In conditions of mutual dependence and economic scarcity, you cannot afford to distribute favors that go to waste. Networks of mutual generosity sound lovely, but in practice they're fraught with difficulty. Because gifts and favors are rarely calculable in precise terms, and because they're generally not returned at once, but in some indefinite future, there's endless scope for grievance or complaint that one party or the other is being less generous than it should. A loan is welcome, but should it be at interest or not? And what if the debtor cannot, or says he cannot, repay at the agreed time? Are people honest when they say what they need? Or are they fleecing you out of greed? And are those who say they cannot help you secretly hoarding money they don't wish to give? Interdependence among kin may contain sufficiently high expectations of obligation to smooth over these causes of conflict, but even kinship reciprocities fail. And the looser, non-ascribed relationship of gift and counter-gift among friends and neighbors are ever prone to aggression and mistrust. Trust, in fact, is crucial because one can only afford to give to those who are likely to give in return. Migrants, strangers, those you don't know enough to trust are beyond the circle of reliable reciprocity. With enemies, one swaps only insults, or worse. So far, I've talked about horizontal relationships with those more or less at the same social level as oneself. New Testament scholars have been fascinated, I think rather over-fascinated, in my view, by the occurrence of vertical relations between patrons and clients. Patrons are those who have a permanently superior status and significantly better access to power or resources. Material resources here flow only downwards from patron to client, while the client returns honor, gratitude, or services that in fact reinforce the hierarchical difference. Civic benefactors in Greek cities were a kind of communal patron who paid for festivals and sports contests and civic buildings. In the Roman system of patronage, wealthy individuals would favor clients who would bring them some social or political benefit. The problem with the poor was that they had little, if anything, with which to benefit the rich, unless they were citizens in a context where voting really mattered. Occasionally, the rich might subsidize food prices or, quote unquote, generously release grain that they had stored until the price was very high. But it was only in Rome that there was a regular grain distribution to large numbers of people, state handouts, only in Rome, and there only to citizens, and only to 1/5 of the city population. On the whole, however, the poor depended not on the rich, but on each other. In their fluctuating fortunes, they would hope that someone in their network of kin, friends, and neighbors would be able to lend a hand, on the understanding that they would do the same in return when they were able to do so. If they survived at all, it was because of their resilience, their resourcefulness, and because of the effectiveness and breadth of these networks. Of course, from our perspective, a shockingly high percentage did not survive, but were lost in early childhood or died of disease or injury at a premature age. Secondly, then, early Christianity among the poor. How do we fit early Christianity into this context? My time span by early Christianity is the first 2 centuries. At least that's as far as I've got in my research so far. Early Christian discourse on this matter is heavily indebted to its Jewish heritage, to texts, traditions, and practices that have developed among the Jewish people. I don't have time to explore that here, but in any detail. In summary form, and I've just put the summary form really on your handout, we may say the following. Jewish texts of all genres speak regularly about the poor as a juridical category, as the oppressed who routinely suffer from the powerful. And they speak of the duty of others to care for the poor, not least in the emblematic figure of widows and orphans. That's those who've lost their networks of support. Now, this is one important difference between Jewish and Greco-Roman discourse. It's not that no one cared about the poor in the non-Jewish world, but the poor were not specifically named or specifically targeted. There are complex reasons for that difference, but it means that the Jewish discourse inherited by the early Christians and supplemented, indeed sharpened by Jesus, paid regular attention to the poor as a social category. Jews, it seems, gave money and goods to the poor out of principle, and not just from the haphazard feelings of compassion that sometimes induced Greeks and Romans to toss coins to beggars. They did. I mean, that's why there are beggars in the ancient world. People occasionally toss them coins. But that's different from out of principle giving. Out of principle here means on the basis of specific divine commands, which carried for Jews hefty sanctions for disobedience. Now, the destitute in antiquity regularly cursed people who failed to help them. But the Jewish tradition included a specific set of instructions and punishments that applied to all Jews and raised the stakes for non-giving extremely high. Thirdly, in the post-exilic and in diaspora context, giving to the poor was primarily, I think, about ethnic solidarity. The poor recipients of aid, in other words, were fellow Jews. In Jewish literature, such as the famous story of Tobit, fellow Jews are depicted as brothers and sisters, the kinship language entailing, as we've seen, an unquestionable moral obligation to give aid. Jewish networks in the diaspora were often limited to the Jewish community of mutuality by rules against marrying non-Jews and against eating unclean food. That limited who you could eat with. So the networks of mutuality were bound to fall largely among fellow Jews. Jewish laws on giving to the poor ensured, though, that everyone felt responsible, every Jew felt responsible for their fellow Jews. We have no evidence, I think, of institutions or organized systems of Jewish charity until the 3rd century AD. But informal acts of mercy and support probably ensured the survival of poor and destitute Jews who would not otherwise have survived. Finally, we should note an important Jewish motive for giving even to the poorest, who, of course, could not reciprocate in any worthwhile form. In Jewish texts, God is figured as not only the overseer of generosity, but also as its rewarder. Give to the poor, and God will give back to you. Early Jewish wisdom texts imagine this divine reward taking place in this worldly terms, but by the 1st century, and in contexts which confidently speak of an afterlife, the reward is figured as a future return, a treasure stored up in heaven. Note that here too, giving to the poor still operates in reciprocity. It's just that the poor themselves will not return, but the return is, as it were, outsourced to God and deferred to the future. Where a human return is unlikely and the inclination to give is correspondingly low, the notion of a divine return may have nudged Jewish givers to be more generous, and generous to more people, than they would normally have wanted to be. Now, the early Christian movement was strongly colored by, benefited from these Jewish thematics, which it developed and reframed in important ways. Most Christians of the first few centuries were, as I've said, themselves poor. There were exceptions, of course, with some wealthy converts, especially in Rome and in Alexandria. But the early Christian texts have nothing good to say about wealth, and quite a lot bad. And the general presumption is that the rich are unlikely to want to join a church because they would thereby cut their valuable ties to the pagan world. How hard it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. In fact, if the rich did show an interest in the Christian faith, they were thought very likely soon to drift away, as the thorns and thistles of their material investment will stifle their faith. One can understand why. Early Christianity had radical expectations of the sharing of wealth, and the rich could retain their wealth only if they distanced themselves from these demanding fellow believers. Socioeconomic data are extremely hard to come by, but a lot of Christian sources presume that Christian believers are craftsmen or artisans of various sorts, working with their hands, as Ephesians puts it, so as to have enough in good times to give to those in need. Celsus, a second-century pagan critic of Christianity, speaks disparagingly of Christian workers in wool and leather and washerwomen. You can hear the kind of disdain in his voice. He looks down with elite snobbery on Christians as hailing from among the uneducated and gullible poor. One interesting token of this reality is the way that there developed among early Christians a tradition of fasting, whose rationale is that from the money or food that you save by fasting, and only in that way will you have something to give to those who have nothing. Thus Hermas, a second-century Christian, urges his fellow Christians, and I put this quote on your handout, urges his fellow Christians to taste nothing but bread and water on the day you fast, then estimate the cost of the food you would have eaten on that day, and give that amount to a widow or orphan, or someone in need. Aristides, a Christian apologist of the second century, indicates something similar. When there is one among them, the Christians, who is needy or poor, and they do not have surplus resources, they fast, he says, for 2 or 3 days in order to supply to the poor their lack of food. As the Gospel of Thomas puts it, blessed are those who hunger, so that they may fill the belly of one who desires. What's striking here is the assumption that the Christians in view will have no resources with which to feed others and will have spare food or cash only if they go without food themselves. We're talking about Christians living on the margin and showing precisely the kind of generous sharing that goes on in networks among the poor to this day. In these networks, the same people could be at one time givers and at another receivers, as their circumstances changed. In a text called the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles, which comes from the end of the first century, believers are urged, do not be one who reaches out your hands to receive, but draws them back from giving. Same people are likely to do both things. In the same text, it's clear that their generosity is real, but necessarily limited by the resources at their command. Hospitality is to be offered to traveling Christians, and hospitality is a very significant service for a newcomer. Help him, it says, as much as you can. He should not stay with you more than 2 or 3 days if need be. If he wants to remain with you and is a craftsman, let him work and eat. If he doesn't have a trade, use your foresight to determine how he as a Christian might live among you without being idle. This is a community that does what it can but cannot afford spongers. 2 or 3 days is a maximum stay. Even apostles and prophets should not stay more than a day, or at a pinch 2. If this so-called apostle stays 3 days, says the Didache, he is clearly a false prophet. That's a text you might like to display somewhere subtly in your home for the attention of visitors who overstay their welcome. Help as much as you can. Note that. These and similar instructions elsewhere display a sensitivity to the fact that many Christians had very little, which they could contribute. It's not a set amount, just whatever you can, whatever you may possibly have surplus. One of the reasons that early churches began to develop common funds in which to pool these resources was that all these tiny contributions could do rather little on their own, but collected together could make a significant contribution to those who were overtaken by a sudden crisis. So what were the patterns of early Christian giving among the poor? As tiny communities of mostly the poor in a vast ocean of poverty, their giving, I think, primarily circulated among themselves. All those seemingly general comments in the New Testament about not getting tired of good works and bearing one another's burdens and supporting the weak, these are the routine sharing and exchanging of goods, which is how the poor survive. Christians also called one another kin, brothers and sisters, and thereby, just by using that name, they laid great expectations on one another. To see your brother lacking the essentials of life and not to help them out in any way, to close your heart, as 1 John puts it, would be a moral outrage. But these Christian kinship relations were not natural or ascribed. Christian networks crossed family and ethnic boundaries, creating new networks that had not existed before, linking people who would never otherwise have been in each other's circles of reciprocity. Remember, the poor here means both Jewish and non-Jewish poor within the Christian community, and creating meaningful networks of exchange across that boundary was, as Paul found, no easy task. One of the reasons that the New Testament epistles have to work so hard to instill a community ethic of patience, gentleness, love, and mutual care is that good reciprocity is hard enough in well-established networks, but is extremely difficult to create when you were previously strangers and have no previous history of trust. And here is, I think, an interesting feature about these early Christian communities. Their inner intensity was combined with an in-principle openness to create new links with people presently outside their reciprocal circle. Do good to all, says Paul, especially, but not only to the household of faith. Do good to all. Do not return evil for evil, but always pursue the good of one another and of all. In fact, as you may recall, there are specific gospel instructions about not limiting your giving to the normal circles of reciprocity, to those with whom you're already engaged in mutual exchange. If you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what's special about that? Do not Gentiles do that? Luke has a variant of the same. If you love those who love you, if you do good, that's give benefits to those who do good to you. If you lend to those from whom you're confident you'll get it back, what Jesus says is special about that. The same ethic in multiple fluid forms runs through early Christian literature, from the Gospel of Thomas to Justin Martyr and other second-century apologists. This is about extending networks, making small or large gestures of goodwill outside the circles of those you already know and trust. And this is risky. Your loan may not be repaid. The recipient of a kind gesture may be ungrateful and never reciprocate. But the urge seems always present to push the boundaries out and to risk new contacts, even if you're sometimes taken for a ride. These outward gestures that may not be reciprocated can be explained in one of two ways. They either look deliberately beyond human return to a divine reciprocation in another form and at another time, or they spread generosity outwards in order to make new friends. The first is a motif we find in Luke. Don't invite to your meals friends and relatives who can and will repay. Rather, invite the poor, the lame, the disabled, and the blind. They will not be able to repay, but you are blessed nonetheless, or all the more, because it will be repaid to you in the resurrection of the righteous. This is Luke 14. Note that this is not what we think of when we talk of a wholly disinterested gift or a gift with no return. There will and should be a return, only not now and not from a human source. This is an ethic, as in the Jewish tradition, that can extend generosity beyond the normal circles where no reciprocity is likely or even possible. It can go, in other words, all the way down to the very bottom of the social pyramid, to destitute beggars who no one would invite into their houses for a meal. No one normally. They can't reciprocate, but God will. But the second rationale for the Christian hyper-extension of generosity is that it just may, create new friends and form new circles of exchange. The striking instructions in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke to love your enemies echo right through early Christianity in numerous variants. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you, and so on. The early Christians recognized that these were what they called great and remarkable commands, but they sometimes made explicit what I think was implicit in them all. The purpose of loving your enemies was to try and make them your friends. As the Didache puts it, you should love those who hate you, and then you will have no enemy. Here again, the law of reciprocity is at work. If you're generous in services and goods to those who are hostile to you, you will put them under an obligation to make some return to you. If someone sues you for your shirt, this isn't the Sermon on the Mount, he sues you because he thinks it is his by right. If someone sues you for your shirt, not only don't curse or resist him, but let him have the shirt and let him have your cloak as well. If you let him have your cloak as well, he would have to recognize that as a gift, not a due. And then you've opened the possibility of a gift exchange, a friendship. Now, he may not respond well, and he may reject your gestures of kindness. That's a risk you have to take, and a lot about early Christianity is about extraordinary risk-taking. But it's possible that, as Justin Martyr puts it, you might thereby persuade them or win them over, and by drawing them into friendship, draw them into the circle of the church. Here and elsewhere, one senses that the boundary-crossing generosity of the church is part and parcel of its mission. It feels under compulsion to reach out across family, ethnic, and social barriers. And this display of abnormal generosity is one of its chief means of doing so. The care and even healing of the sick is, I think, one of the best examples of this dynamic. If working adults got sick, the family finances suddenly collapsed. And the people we're talking about are those who have no financial reserves. If children got sick, someone had to look after them and thereby lose work, while medicines, charms, and sacrifices for healing were all expensive remedies. When Jesus healed a man with a disabled arm, this is Matthew 12 or Mark 3, he was enabling someone to work or work again. In fact, Jerome quotes from a version of that story, which is not otherwise known to us, where the man says to Jesus, "I was a mason who made a living with my hands. I beseech you, Jesus, restore my health, so I do not have to beg for food in shame." Interesting, the imagination of that story, you think this through. Well, what would it mean? This is about somebody who works with their hands, like a mason. The gospel stories, the book of Acts, and the many further apocryphal Acts, Acts of Thomas, Acts of John, and 7, are full of stories of remarkable Christian healings, which were not just demonstrations of power, but massively beneficial acts with huge social and economic implications. The widow's son in Nain, Luke 7, was her economic mainstay. The beggar in the temple, Acts 3, would no longer have to beg. The same benefit, of course, was operative in less spectacular forms of care for the sick, nursing them back to health, which may have been a more routine form of healing among early Christians. You will remember that the Good Samaritan came across a man he did not know, who had been left by the roadside, beaten up, unconscious, and, this is important, stripped of his clothes. Clothes were a major expense for the poor in antiquity, so it was common to borrow or indeed to steal clothes. But clothes also declared your social status. The rich had warmer, well-made, and white clothing, while the poor were renowned for their torn, thin, and dirty clothes. Once the man has been stripped and he's lying by the road naked, no one knows his social status. Was he a rich man worth saving in the hope of a reward? Or was he a poor man worth nothing, the kind of person one walks by without lifting a finger? No one knew. But the Samaritan cared for him anyway, because he regarded him as a neighbor. That is, he drew him into the circle of generosity, though, of course, with the chance he would get nothing in return. That impetus is found right across early Christianity, climaxing in dramatic form in the ways that Christians became famous in the 3rd century in caring for plague victims in the time of Cyprian in North Africa. In fact, I think one of the reasons why widows became so important in early Christianity is because they became themselves agents of prayer, attending to the sick as they moved from house to house, and much in demand not only by Christians, but by non-Christians as well. The ideology of sex in the ancient world, as you may know, is that sex is always polluting. So widows were especially important prayers closer to God because they were not sexually active. As pure prayer warriors and carers, with access into the female quarters of homes, they became, I think, the most effective missionaries in the early church. As they cared for you in the name of Jesus, and especially if you got better as a result of their prayers, you'd want to know more about this powerful Savior called Jesus. What drove this urge towards outward-moving generosity, even at risk of rejection and waste? Here I come to my final section. At the theological level, we find a rich theology of the generosity of God, which became a special emphasis of early Christian preaching. This could be grounded in a theology of creation. God gives rain and sunshine to all without regard to their worth, and continues to give in benevolence even to the ungrateful. But early Christian theology generally gained a specifically Christological focus, recounting the massive act of generosity enacted in the Christ event. They did not use this, as is our tendency, to downplay or deny that God is judge, who will one day execute his judgment on those who are unresponsive to his love. But they saw the coming of Christ as a massive, unconditioned goodwill gesture on the part of God, offering salvation in this window of opportunity to people who had done nothing to deserve it. As this good news spread into the Gentile world, it was clear there was plenty for God to forgive. The Gentiles invited into the church had a lifetime of mistaken religion and, in Jewish terms, an appalling moral lifestyle. But nonetheless, God's goodness and grace reached even to them. Grace is a theme we associate particularly with Paul, but it resonates right through early Christian literature and drives to great lyrical heights the 2nd century author of the text we know as the Epistle to Diognetus. For our unrighteous way of life, he says, came to fruition. It became perfectly clear that it could expect only punishment and death as its ultimate reward. But then when the time arrived that God had planned to reveal at last his goodness and power, oh, the supreme beneficence and goodness of God. He did not hate us, destroy us, or hold a grudge against us. But he was patient, he bore with us, and out of pity on us, he took our sins upon himself. Oh, the sweet exchange. Oh, the unexpected acts of benevolence. This is what inspires the same author to describe as the ethos of Christians, that they love everyone, even though they're persecuted by all. They're impoverished, but they make many rich. They are reviled, but they bless. No doubt many Christians failed to be as generous as this suggests, but the good news that founded their communities of divine benevolence formed a powerful impetus to attempt a generosity something like God's. In this theology, God, or more specifically Christ, is sometimes figured as the example to emulate and sometimes as the source of all the good things that cascade through Christians and on to others. Sometimes, as in the parable of the sheep and the goats, Christ is figured as the hidden object of the generosity of believers, a Christological form of the Jewish notion that in giving to a beggar, one gives to God. And sometimes as the one who guarantees a greater and more lasting return than the material things one might give to those in need. From the sayings and parables of Jesus onwards, early Christian discourse is full of this language of reward, crown, harvest, or treasure in heaven, of friends and houses made ready in the heavenly, eternal realm. Protestants have been very uncomfortable with this language, have often tried to play it down, but it expresses the basic assumption of antiquity that every gift invites and expects a return. Theologically, we might want to re-express it something like this. Our generosity is both an outflow and a form of participation in the generous self-giving which is at the heart of God. We do not generate this ourselves, but we enter, as it were, into the stream of gift that cascades from God into the world. And in that participation, we are ourselves fulfilled, rewarded, if you like, at a level and in a form much deeper than the material forms of this world. Being drawn into this divine reality, we become most truly what we were designed to be, co-participants in a web of gift, a stream that cascades through us to others and through others to us. The language of eschatology of treasure in heaven expresses well, I think, the otherness of this depth into which we enter. It's transcendent, of a kind and place greater than anything we can imagine. Thus, paradoxically, in giving to others, we are most fully enriched ourselves. Not in some simple quid pro quo, and certainly not in the material terms of a prosperity gospel, but in the sense that we are fulfilled as loving creatures in the love that upholds, saves, and will redeem this world. Now, where might all this go in terms of a Christian ethic of gift today? Most Christians in the world today are, by any standard, poor, as were most early Christians in the first few centuries. Those of us who are not are the oddities. And giving from a distance to the poor is never the same as giving as and among the poor. Give us this day our daily bread sounds a bit hollow in our mouths. That's what it means to live by day. Give us this day our daily bread. Living among and getting to know the poor so that they become not the poor, a distancing label, but Jim and Betty and Lisa and Mike, would be a significant step forward. But I've also suggested that reciprocity in gifts that go to and fro is a Christian virtue. This runs against our modern fetish for the one-way gift, which is strongly shaped by Western ideologies of individual independence. Those who know community organizing principles will have heard of asset-based community development, which is predicated on the assumption that everyone, even those with few material goods, have important things to contribute. They deserve the dignity of being themselves in some form givers, not humiliated as passive receivers of our charity. And this suggests more generally that we should question certain notions of altruism, notions which owe more to Immanuel Kant and Auguste Comte than to the Christian tradition. If altruism is defined as one-way gift, wholly disinterested in the sense that I want and will accept no return, it becomes a mask for autonomous self-sufficiency, for the pride that refuses to accept from others because my generosity must not be reciprocated. There are deep philosophical issues here whose discussion goes back to Aristotle, and you'll be relieved to hear I won't start off on that track now. But I hope you can get a sense of why I think that exploring the gift dynamics and theologies of the early Christians opens up a whole set of contemporary issues beyond its purely historical interest. Placing the early Christians among the poor and exploring their part in the survival of the poor helps us to think about networks of generosity and about how and why the Christian impulse has always been to go beyond the comfortable towards risky and costly generosity. And it reminds us of what the early Christians took for granted in painfully blunt terms, that if we have material resources and we see our sisters and brothers in desperate need, and do nothing serious about it, we do not deserve the name Christian, and we cannot say that we abide in the love of God. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John, for a wonderful lecture. We realise that a few might need to slip away, but we do have some time for a number of questions now. Who would like to begin? Yes. Well, I'll pass you the mic around just so for those who are watching it.
I went to church on Sunday evening, and fortunately for me, there was one. So I'm new to where I live.
Right.
Some very kind people gave me a lift home. And we were talking, and I said I'd been to a concert that had been on, a recital probably. And she said, "Oh, our son would have gone to that. What was the payment of that?" And I said it was a koha, and she said, "Well, he would give nothing because he doesn't give anything for koha." And I thought to myself, I decided when I looked at my purse, only 2 days to go to pension.
Yeah.
So I gave them the $10, and then I thought after I was going to say something to her that it's all right, I've given $5 for him, but I didn't. But I do have a habit, unfortunately, of telling people that you can't be a Christian if you vote National.
Well, I won't get into the politics of that, but I do think, I've often thought, if a church is not known for its generosity, it can't really claim to be a church at all. It seems to me it's just kind of one of the basic marks of a church. If it's known for its stinginess, and sadly churches sometimes are, or for just being difficult about material resources, it's somehow not reflecting that sort of open-handed generosity that is the Christian calling. And as I say, one of the interesting things about the Christian tradition, and this it shares with the Jewish tradition, is that it enables that generosity to be in large or in very small kind. It's not about, well, you must give this amount, or even actually, interestingly, the Christian tradition did not take over the tithe rule, which is actually very punishing on those whose margins are very, very small. It just said, give what you can. And that means everybody has the capacity and the ability, at least in good times, to be part of that cascade of divine gift. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That's amazing. I wonder if you've done any thinking about what a social welfare society does to this. It could be an argument, a simplistic argument to say, well, in the Roman times it was much easier. It was simpler.
Right. Oh, well, all kinds of complicated things, yes. I think obviously the good thing about it is there's a safety net. Our experience in the UK is the safety net is just developing holes all over the place. And the churches are finding themselves being drawn back into sort of basic social care that a generation ago you would have thought, well, surely the state will cover that. One of the effects of the welfare state is that it can encourage a sense that giving is a one-way thing. Say I'm a great believer in the welfare state, but it coalesces, I think, with a kind of Western ideology that to give is to give to, and we need to think harder about communities where good reciprocity is enabled and encouraged. I think one of the, at the international level, one of the fascinating things is how the whole ideology of aid and development is changing from, how we give to those poor countries over there to how do we enable those poor countries to be vibrant communities of wealth creation and of social development so that we can be in a mutually reciprocally beneficial relationship. And I think sometimes the kind of pouring wealth into a so-called deprived community can create dependencies and humiliations which disable, strikingly disable people. And from my limited experience in this, what is most fruitful, encouraging is when you see gifts develop and emerge, this sort of asset-based ideology, which I find now being increasingly used by state agencies as well as by churches. Yeah.
Greg, and then Andrew.
Hi, John. Thanks for a really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about how Christian forgiveness kind of maps on to what you've said. It seems that our concept of forgiveness is often one of unconditional and unilateral giving. Yeah. And I was wondering whether you also wanted to reconfigure that to be more of reciprocity, and whether you thought that was also the result of our modern-day fetish.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And forgiveness is a particularly complex form of giving, isn't it? It is a form of giving, and it's not accidental that in Greek to forgive is the Greek verb is charizomai, which is related to the Greek word charis. Charizomai is to be beneficial. The interesting thing about forgiveness, in as much as I've thought about it, is for it truly to be operative, it has to be reciprocal. You can offer forgiveness to a person, but that forgiveness only really takes effect when there's a reconciled relationship. In other words, the person has to accept that forgiveness, which involves an admission of guilt. You can't, in one sense then, the gift is only fulfilled when it is accepted. Now, what I want to say is that the Christian dynamic is to offer forgiveness without condition. That's to say, it has this outward forming reach, and you can offer forgiveness, and it may never be reciprocated. But in one sense, an important sense, that gift only comes to fruition, to fulfillment, when there's a restored relationship, when the previous hostility ceases, when the enemy becomes a friend. And that's what forgiveness aims at, it seems to me. There's all fascinating discussions about, can people involved in the Holocaust ever be forgiven? And in one sense, they can't, because their victims are dead. And it's questionable how much other people can forgive them. Other Jews or others could ever forgive somebody for what they did in the Holocaust. And that's the famous example that's been much discussed, Derrida and others in the last generation or so. And I think it puts the finger on the fact that in one sense, forgiveness cannot be properly fulfilled until it is accepted, and as accepted, it creates a possibility of friendship, or it creates a new relationship at the very least, which gets you beyond the previous hostility. And in that sense, there's an element of reciprocity in the fulfillment of the gift.
John, one of the things that occurs to me is that gifting amongst the genuinely poor and destitute is uncomfortable and dirty and smelly and dangerous.
Yeah.
And I look around and I suspect that there's not too many of us that are afraid to sit on the couch because there might be a needle that they'd be stuck with.
Might be a what?
A used needle that they'd be stuck with.
Right.
Can you just talk a little bit about the people here?
Oh, right.
And
Yeah, well, I've got limited experience. I live in a village, ex-mining village outside Durham, which is, by all social standards, one of the more deprived areas of England. And getting involved there, yeah, it's really complicated and very messy and very, and often difficult, and relationships are very fragile. But you know, the beautiful things sometimes happen where people do things for others. You know, work in a cafe, take people meals to their homes, look after the aged and the isolated, care for each other's children, and so on, and create new relationships that they otherwise just wouldn't have. Beautiful things can happen and can draw out the gifts, you know, of people who are very, very reluctant to offer anything of themselves, or have got so little confidence they don't think they've got anything to offer. And I think being among and helping to be a catalyst in some small way to that kind of mutual sharing, it's impossible to do from a distance. Absolutely impossible to do from a distance. And to some extent, one can never get over, you know, a large material difference, but you can get socially involved in certain ways. But giving, you know, anybody can write a check, or actually being involved in people's lives is really complicated. Yeah.
Thank you, John, for your excellent talk this evening. I was just wondering about through the Good Samaritan story. Do you think that we've lost sight of the fact that giving is not just something for a reward in eternity, but in fact is something that can drive us into eternity? In terms of we love all sorts of mechanics of how you become saved and how you receive eternity, and yet Jesus was also answering the question not just about who is my neighbour, but the scribe asked, how do I enter eternity?
Yes.
So do you think giving is a key, something of that true religion, perhaps that goes back into the Old Testament of the widow, the orphan, the alien, is also our modern sense of perhaps we should be driving that more strongly in our Christian teaching?
Yeah, I see it as the way, or one of the key ways in which we enter into the whole dynamic of the gospel, which is about God's generosity towards the world. And it's a generosity of many dimensions. But one of the ways we express that, and as I say, enter into it, participate in it, is through practical expressions of generous giving. And it's as where I don't like to see it too much as a kind of contractual relationship, as, you know, we do this and God will do that, or whatever. It's about, as I prefer to express it, in terms of kind of participation in, or being drawn into the heart of God. And that's what it is to inherit eternal life. You know, and there's a kind of simplicity and bluntness, I think, about early Christianity that says, and if you have resources and you see those who don't have it, you do anything about it, who are you to say God's love abides in you? I mean, it clearly doesn't. You know, you know that God's love abides in you, or you abide in God's love, to use the Johannine terminology, precisely as you express that love in practical ways. And if you don't, there's no evidence you're really part of this. You're part of this dynamic. So I kind of think of the sort of the grace or the generosity of God as kind of like, it's almost like the kind of the flow of the water, or to change the image, the kind of the power in the electric system, where we join ourselves to it and participate in it. And that is interesting. You know, that is, of course, our ultimate fulfillment. And that's why I think we can push back against certain notions of, well, of course I do this, but there's nothing in it for me. I don't want anything in it for me. I don't to say there'll be something in it. Well, of course we are fulfilled precisely in doing this. And certain notions of altruism as self-negation seem to me quite unnecessary and quite unhelpful in this. It's fine to say, well, yeah, this is how I reach what God designs me to be, precisely in giving. Yeah.
The issue you mentioned earlier on about the Protestants having trouble giving. So, are you able to elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, Protestants have trouble with the language of reward, of the language of, if you do it, God will reward you. I mean, Luther had a lot of trouble with that. Calvin struggled to make something of it. But in the Protestant tradition, there's been this anxiety about heavenly rewards, about treasure in heaven, about if you sow, you will reap. Because it looks like then salvation is in some sense dependent or conditional on something I do. The Catholic tradition has been just much more comfortable with that. Not that Catholics believe in earning your own salvation, of course, but that whole dynamic of reward and merit is deep in the Catholic tradition and something that Protestantism reacted against. What I'd like to say is there are ways in which, I hope I can find ways in which this sort of sensibility of fulfillment in participation in divine grace is something that Protestants can also come on board with. But the Protestant anxiety about reward gets taken up, I think, by Kant, Immanuel Kant, and in philosophy inspired by him, to the sense that I must do for you, but I don't want anything back from you, because that would sully or damage or limit or weaken the gift. And this anxiety about reciprocity, which runs right through our culture, I think, of Western cultures, or Protestant-influenced Western cultures, is something I think we need to push back against.
So what would be the reciprocity that they fear if they give somebody and they get something back?
The fear is that it's not truly pure. It's not truly a pure gift. It's not truly, if it has an element of quid pro quo, an element of return, then it's not truly a kind of pure gift. It's not altruistic in the sense that there's no possibility of return. That's the language that we've developed since the 19th century in particular. In the way we've talked about. I mean, even if you look up sort of dictionary definitions of altruism, they say, well, synonyms are self-negation. I think that's really unhelpful. We either got to drop the word altruism or we've got to redefine it. Because if it means self-negation, as if there's a zero-sum game, if I give to you, I must suffer. Why can't I give to you in a way that our friendship then means we both flourish?
What's that word, charity?
Yes, so the word charity, it can have that kind of, it depends what the connotations come with the word charity. And I've actually not used the word charity because I think the word charity has too much built in modern language, modern association with the one-way gift. It's a charitable gift, and therefore I get no benefit, I should get no benefit from it. It's charity. And we've set up this antithesis between charity and, let's say, commerce, or the charitable sphere and the market sphere. And that antithesis, which has deep philosophical roots, but it also correlates to developments in Western society and economics, is, I think, very, very unfortunate. And in most cultures, Maori culture, but most cultures, it's obvious that gifts invite reciprocity. That's what gifts are for. Charity is about creating social bonds in which I give to you and you'll give back to me. That's good charity. But in the Western philosophy, charity, we become anxious about the return in a way that I think we don't need to be.
Final question, Nick.
Thank you very much for your lecture. You've drawn on an impressive range of early Christian literature or texts that refer to giving and generosity. And I guess the first thing that I think about when I see texts in early Christian literature is the relative expense of the production of texts. And so I guess my question would be, what is the relationship between those who are financing the production of the text and the exhortations of giving and generosity for those at subsistence level found within the text?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, to some extent, you can write letters relatively cheaply, because not all writing material, I mean, papyrus material is not that expensive. It doesn't mean everybody can read them. Paul says, make sure this letter is read to everybody, but it doesn't assume that everybody can read. And literacy levels, interesting, go further down the social scale than you might expect, I think, in the ancient world. But you're right, certain kinds of early Christian texts required quite a high level of education, and certain kinds of literature, early Christian, I mean, when you get to Clement of Alexandria, you're overhearing a conversation taking place among elite, a cadre of sort of elite, highly educated Christians in Alexandria. So I don't want to deny that there are, in certain places, wealthy Christians emerge. I just think we've been over-fascinated by them and overawed by them because they're a bit like us, and we kind of associate with them. So I think to answer your question, some literature is elite literature. Some early Christian literature, I mean, if you read The Shepherd of Hermas, it's not elite literature. It's fairly crude, actually. It's very, very repetitive, and it's fairly basic in its literary styles. So not all of it is sort of high literature by any means. In fact, one of the things that frustrates me is that classicists who are looking for evidence of the poor in antiquity, they rarely look at early Christian literature, because I think there's more there that they could find, and there's more in Jewish literature they could find as well. So I think not all early Christian literature is elite literature. Not all of it requires a high education. Not all of it requires that its recipients have a high education. But I grant that there are some cases where you do feel you're in a different social bracket, somewhere up, levels 3 or 4 or something on that scale. Yeah, thank you.
As John mentioned, he and Diana have been here a number of times. I'm often at conferences and somebody will sidle up to me and say, I hear John Barclay's coming to Dunedin, or I hear John Barclay's been with you for some time, and you can hear the undertone in their voices. How did you manage that? and how lucky you are, and how fortunate we know we are having heard such an outstanding lecture tonight, one that's been so widely informing of us and so very, very challenging as well. So please join me in thanking John for coming again to Dunedin.
Thank you very much. Thank you.